we might dive into our presentation for this evening. We are pleased to have Dr. Michele Ward with us this evening to be talking to us more about recovery, the environment, and the challenges we have as a biodiversity crisis. Michele is a lecturer at Griffith University and researcher, and brings together some different perspectives to make her research work what it is. Won't take any more away from it though. Without further ado, welcome, Michele.
Thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Michele Ward. I'm a lecturer over at Griffith University. So I'll step back so then people can see me. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations on the lands and waters of Australia, in particular the Turrbal, Yagara and Gubbi Gubbi country where I live and work, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and express my gratitude for their long and ongoing custodianship of country. So for tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and where I've come from. Then I'll dive straight into the state of nature globally, Australia, and focus in on Queensland. I'll look at drivers of change and practical solutions that we've been working on. And then I thought we'd just open it up for discussion and questions. So a little bit about me. I have a bachelor's and master's in science and education, a master's and a PhD in conservation ecology. I then went and did a postdoc at UQ with Professor Hugh Possingham and James Watson. I was lead scientist of WWF Australia, so Worldwide Fund for Nature, not the World Wrestling Fund, which was what my family thought I was doing, strangely. And now for the last 12 months, I've been at Griffith University, just at Nathan campus as a lecturer and researcher. So the science is pretty unequivocal. We are living in a dual crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change. So far, we have lost more than 50% of land. It's either been moderately changed or severely changed, whether that be from agriculture or urban development. And then that has obviously put our protected areas at strain. So we now have more than 90% of our global protected areas really disconnected, fragmented, and degraded because of that sort of land use change that's happening throughout the network. When we incorporate climate change into that, we know that it'll probably impact more than 42% of land. And then when we look at the combination of climate change and human free pressure land, we find that less than 19% will have that combination of free of human pressure and climatically stable. And that's under the assumption that we don't alter any more land. So it's not much land for our little species to survive in. So therefore, it's not surprising that we have, more than 1 million species threatened with extinction. Most of the drivers of destruction come from agriculture. So from 2000 to 2019, 90% of our global deforestation was from cropping or pasture land expansion. So it's no wonder that when we look at sort of the breakdown of what is driving decline in our species globally, it's things like overexploitation, mostly logging, and then the agricultural activity being the second biggest driver. So over the last 300 years, globally, we've lost about 1,000 species. 1,000 species have gone extinct. In Australia, that's about 100. You'll probably notice some of the mammals on the side here. So the Christmas Island pipistrelle, Tassie tiger, Bramble Cay melomee down the bottom, which was the most recent extinction in Australia. Australia is the #1 nation for extinctions of our small mammals, and that's mostly due to cats and invasive foxes and habitat loss. So we have more than 1 million species now threatened with extinction. And I often get questioned, extinction is a natural part of evolution within the globe, within Earth's history. And that's absolutely true. But what we're seeing now is that the species are going extinct 100 to 1,000 times greater than the background rate. So we're experiencing what we call a 6 mass extinction. We've had 5 in the past. The last one was at the end of the Cretaceous period where we lost our dinosaurs. So yeah, this mass extinction is from human activity. It's the only mass extinction that's been driven by humans or one species. Australia is not immune to this problem. See if I can play that. So we assume that Australia is a developed country with really great governance, that we would have a handle on our threats and our habitat destruction, but it's just not the case. So for over 17 years since the inauguration of our big sort of federal legislation, the EPBC Act, or the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, we lost about 7.7 million hectares of threatened species habitat. So it's not weeds and it's not regrowth, it's often old growth habitat, mostly in Queensland, unfortunately, in the last 3 decades. And we found that 7% of that was unregulated. So it sort of was cleared with no oversight under the EPBC Act. So this is a direct result of a failure of our EPBC Act. And it's not just a failure of our federal legislation, but our state and local government legislations are also failing our threatened species. So the video I'm showing here is after the 2019-2020 mega fires. In New South Wales, the New South Wales government, or the New South Wales Logging Corp, went in and cleared massive areas of greater glider habitat. And this was one of the last sort of refugia places that this species had within that area. So when we look across Australia, we find that more than 60% of the country is now either moderately or highly degraded. So the dark green areas are intact, which means sort of free from that human industrial pressure. And then the dark... Okay, thank you. And then the dark brown are areas that are highly degraded or completely converted. So most of this clearing occurred sort of in South Australia and Victoria and New South Wales many decades ago, but from the last 3 decades-ish, we've seen Queensland as the area which is experiencing the most clearing. So in 1 year, in 2018-2019, we found that 680,000 hectares of habitat had been destroyed. And just in that one year, if Queensland was a country, it would have been the 9th highest forest destroying nation in the world, just above China. And most of that is for pasture. So that's for cattle grazing. So why is this a problem? So forests are, really important for water quality. They protect erosion. They protect our soils by preventing erosion. They increase productivity of nearby crops by hosting pollinators and providing shade trees for cattle and sheep. They sequester carbon, which helps with our climate change problem. They make the ground cooler and wetter, which makes many parts of Queensland less drought prone or fire prone. And obviously Queensland is one of the most biodiverse states in the country. And so our forests are critical for the survival of many of our species that we love. But beyond habitat destruction, these species have to deal with not only habitat loss, but disease and invasive predators. So I mentioned invasive cats and foxes being a #1 driver of our small little mammals, logging and changed fire regimes. So this has resulted in mass extirpation or local extinction of species. So this was a paper that we did in 2022 where we looked at and mapped all the historical habitats for now threatened birds across Australia and where they are now. And we found that particularly in areas in sort of South Australia, some of these areas have lost 17 species since European colonisation. And that extinction wave is just sort of slowly rolling up the east coast into the Northern Territory. Similar patterns to the previous map that I showed on the Australian footprint. One of the big emerging threats in Australia and globally is this regime shift of fire. So you would have remembered that in 2019-2020, we had the big mega fires. It burnt about 97,000 square kilometres of land. And to put that in perspective, so we always hear about the Californian wildfires. The biggest Californian wildfire was the August Complex Fire, and that was about 4,000 square kilometres. So just magnitudes bigger than what they've ever experienced in California. And 40% of those happened within our protected areas. So we looked at which species were highly impacted. And so this figure shows, so every arrow is a species, and we split the species up into currently not listed federally, vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. And if they pass the yellow line, that means they triggered a vulnerable status. If they pass the blue line, then they trigger an endangered status. And if they pass the red line, they would have triggered a critically endangered status. And so when we did this analysis and further in-depth analysis of each of the different species, it represented a 26% increase in the EPBC Act list from just one event. So it was just massive. And the modelling shows that this fire is just one of many to come. These fires are going to become sort of more common, more widespread, and happen more frequently. So now that I've depressed you all with the biggest problems, I'm going to talk about some of the solutions. So one of the biggest things that I think we need is we need to know where these species are if we're ever going to try and recover them. We need to know where they were, we need to know where they are now, and where they might move under future climate change. So species track their sort of climatic envelopes as the climate changes, and we need to know where those spaces will be. A lot of the time we have these extent of occurrence maps. So for the Gordian finch, for example, these massive areas of where we sort of think they are, but we need far finer resolution maps of where these species are going to be now and into the future. So what we've been working on is looking at, yes, where they are, but what vegetation classes are they associated with? Where can we refine these maps using elevation and soil types that they're associated with? And citizen science data sets are massive. So we use a lot of ALA data and bird life data to try to really figure out where these species are, especially the really cryptic ones. We also need to know what are the threats and what are the actions that these species need. So we've developed these sort of big spreadsheets of like which species are threatened by what and what are the actions. A lot of the time that's quite intuitive. So if they're threatened by too much fire, you need better ecological fire regimes. But with things like, for example, cats, I remember doing this expert elicitation, and a lot of the time the problem of managing invasive cats is too broad. We don't have the technology or the financial resources to manage these species over large scales. And so a lot of the time for small mammals or little reptiles, the action wasn't managing the cats or putting cat traps out. It was restoring the understory or managing invasive herbivores so the understory could thicken up and the species could hide, and the cats couldn't hunt as successfully. So understanding the nuances of what the threat is and what the action is per species, I think, is really important. We also need to know where the locations of these threats are. So there's been some great work by Sarah Legg and Anna Pintor, who have mapped, densities of cats and pigs and where land clearing happens. This needs to happen more broadly, I think, to be able to really understand where we need to be managing these things. And then we also need to know the cost of managing. So we need to be able to inform our governments on how much it's going to cost to manage species to hit some of their sort of national and international obligations that they've signed up to. So Australia has committed to like a halting extinction of species targets. How much is that going to cost? So we've developed these sort of spatially variable cost models looking at where the threat is, how much does it cost to get there, how much does the consumables cost, what is the labour cost, and try to do this sort of spatially across Australia. So now that we have sort of those different elements of the puzzle, we can do things like this. So this is a paper, I don't know if anyone knows April Reside from University of Queensland, but she led this great work which looked at, it was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it was looking at how much does it cost for full recovery of all threatened species across all of their threats. And what we found was it was $583 billion. So just a massive price of years of degradation. But then to put it in perspective, it's only the net worth of 2 billionaires. So we've also been developing these other practical solutions like models for choosing priority umbrella species. So governments love umbrella species. You always hear, Canada has the top 100 species. Australia has chosen, it's now 110, but back in 2010, it was like the top 70 species. And so what we've done for the federal government is develop a more problem-based method for prioritising conservation action. So this is a bit boring, you don't need to read this, but basically the algorithm is choosing species based on how cost-effective they are. So if you've got the koala, for example, and it's threatened by too much fire, invasive cats and foxes, and it geographically intersects with the orchid, who's also threatened by fire, and the bilby, which is threatened by foxes. By managing the koala, you can have all of these sort of co-benefits for the same cost. And so iteratively choosing these umbrella species the most cost-effective way, which maximizes the total number of flora and fauna benefiting from that management, you can get much better results. And so that's what we showed. When you prioritize the government's 70 species, it co-benefits about 100 in total. Whereas if you optimize your algorithm, you can maximize to almost 1,000 species for the same budget. So just developing these sorts of simple solutions are really important to help governments make better decisions. So as I mentioned, Australia has committed to halting extinctions and downlisting its priority species. So here, using the same sort of maps of where things are and what is threatened by them, we were able to calculate that halting extinctions for 99 of the priority species is about 15.8 billion, all the way to delisting, so getting them off the listing, recovering them completely, is about $158 billion. Interestingly, with this paper, what we found was that 6 species could never be downlisted and 16 could never be removed from the threatened species list. And that was mostly due to sort of historical declines or pervasive ongoing unmanageable threats like climate change or disease. Some of the times it was little frogs on the top of mountains where they've got nowhere to move under climate change. So some of these things are just going to have to survive in, I guess, captive breeding until we figure out other solutions. So the cost is really expensive. Conservation actions are really expensive. And so we've been looking at other things that can help foot the bill. Obviously, it's not going to come from government, but it might come through a carbon market scenario or a nature repair market, so a biodiversity market. These two are both emerging markets in Australia. And so we've also looked at how much does it cost to restore ecosystems to the level that we need. What is the break-even carbon price? And so currently our carbon market price, so people can sell their carbon sequestration units for $35 a tonne. But to fully cover the cost of restoration, because restoration is so expensive, it would cost, actually, realistic carbon price would be about $100 to $165 a tonne to do it properly. And so future research of where sort of I'm going and where I think we need to better understand for future researchers to ensure that we are protecting the areas that are really important for biodiversity. So at the moment, the EPBC Act is kind of failing our threatened species. We're still allowing massive clearing in really important old growth areas, and you just can't replace an old growth forest. And so, yeah, protecting areas that are really important for biodiversity is number one for me. My next parts of my research, I'm going to be looking at the various different markets and how they can play a role. I'm sure that you guys know that the carbon market has been a bit of a failure. Really low integrity carbon markets are being handed out with no real sequestration value. So making sure that those markets are high integrity. And then Australia has also signed up to being nature positive. So from 2020, we need to make sure that we are no longer in a state of decline, but on a rise with all of our nature. And so the other part of my research is looking at how can we measure and monitor nature positive on a broad scale, and how do we measure counterfactual? So would we still be seeing nature positive if the action didn't occur? And so, yeah, that's all. Thank you.